The Cooper mansion should have been a place of joy, filled with warmth and love, but the birth of little Lisa was seen as nothing more than an inconvenience. Her arrival, unplanned and unwanted, was met with cold indifference. Mr. and Mrs. Cooper, with hearts as empty as their lavish home, made a chilling decision. Lisa would be abandoned, left to face a world that neither cared for her nor wanted her. The gates of the Cooper mansion loomed large as Kate hesitantly stepped through. Her heart pounded as her eyes traveled over the grand estate. Its sprawling gardens and towering structure exuded wealth that she had never imagined. This was nothing like her modest upbringing. She clutched her worn coat tighter around her, trying to calm her nerves as she approached the door. The butler, Mrs. Gomez, opened it with a stiff expression. The older woman's eyes traveled up and down, scrutinizing Kate in her plain clothes. The corners of her mouth twitched, but she said nothing. A brief nod was the only greeting Kate received before she was led into the house. Inside, everything gleamed. The chandeliers, the polished floors, the tapestries lining the walls, everything spoke of a different world. Yet there was an odd stillness in the air, a coldness that made Kate uneasy. She followed Mrs. Gomez through long hallways without a word, the click of the older woman's heels echoing sharply behind them. They stopped in a large sitting room where Mr. and Mrs. Cooper awaited. Both were seated in large armchairs, their presence dominating the room. Mr. Cooper, in his tailored suit, barely glanced at her, absorbed in a newspaper. Mrs. Cooper, however, fixed Kate with a hard stare, her lips pursed in disapproval. Her hand, heavy with jewelry, gestured toward Kate without enthusiasm. "You will follow the rules." Mrs. Cooper's voice was as sharp as glass, each word clipped. "Your tasks are to be completed with no fuss, no complaints, and you are not to interfere with our personal lives, especially not with our daughter." Kate nodded, trying to suppress the tremble in her hands. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Cooper's eyes narrowed. "You'll answer yes, Mrs. Cooper, when spoken to. Understood?" "Yes, Mrs. Cooper." Kate corrected herself quickly. She felt the weight of their judgment, as if she were already failing, not by her work, but by simply being who she was. The room's air grew tighter with every second. She swallowed her apprehension. She needed this job. Her family depended on the money. But as she stood there under Mrs. Cooper's scrutinizing gaze, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that she had walked into something far colder than she had ever expected. Later that evening, as Kate familiarized herself with the house, she couldn't help but feel the oppressive nature of the mansion. Every creak of the floor, every shadow in the long corridors added to her growing discomfort. She had yet to meet Lisa, the Cooper's daughter, but a strange feeling lingered in the back of her mind. The first encounter happened by accident. Kate was passing a dim hallway when she heard the faintest sound, a child's cry. Pausing, she turned to the door from which the sound came. Hesitant, she knocked softly, but no answer came. Her hand hovered over the doorknob before she pushed it open slightly. Inside, a small girl sat on the floor by a large crib, tears streaming down her face. Kate's heart broke instantly. Lisa's soft sobs filled the quiet room, and though Kate hesitated at first, she quickly crossed the space to kneel by her side. "It's all right, sweetheart," Kate whispered, gently reaching for the little girl. To her surprise, Lisa didn't pull away. Instead, she latched onto Kate's arm, her tiny fingers gripping tightly as though Kate were a lifeline. Her sobs subsided, replaced by quiet sniffles. Kate lifted Lisa into her arms, and the little girl's head immediately nestled into her shoulder. A warmth spread through Kate, and she held Lisa close, rocking her gently. It was a moment of pure connection, a feeling Kate hadn't anticipated. Here was this fragile, neglected child, abandoned in a house filled with everything but care. That night, as Kate prepared to leave the kitchen, she encountered William, the gardener, leaning against the doorway. His face was somber, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "I saw you with the little one," he said quietly. Startled, Kate nodded, unsure how to respond. Will exhaled, a cloud of smoke floating in the air. "Listen, girl, you seem nice enough, but don't go getting too close to that child. The Coopers don't care about her. She was an accident, you know, something they never wanted, and they treat her like one." Kate's stomach twisted at his words. She had seen the truth of them in Lisa's sad eyes. "But she's just a little girl." Kate's voice wavered. Will's gaze softened, but there was a sadness there too. "Don't get attached," he warned. "You'll only get hurt." Kate watched as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the mansion. She stood there, her mind heavy with the weight of his words. But as much as she wanted to heed his advice, something deep inside told her that she couldn't abandon Lisa. Not now. Kate stood quietly in the kitchen, her hands moving mechanically as she rinsed the dishes. She glanced toward the large dining room where Mrs. Cooper sat, staring into the distance, her hands resting limply on her lap. It had been weeks since Mrs. Cooper had shown any interest in Lisa. Kate's heart ached for the child, barely a year old, already neglected by her mother and ignored by her father. Mr. Cooper had been absent from the house more than usual, his business trips growing longer and more frequent. Even when he was home, his presence was cold and distant. He barely acknowledged Lisa, leaving her upbringing entirely to the house staff. The silence between Mr. and Mrs. Cooper had grown thick and palpable, the house suffocating under their unspoken tension. Kate had begun to wonder if they even spoke to each other outside of polite exchanges. Mrs. Cooper had once been radiant, a picture of beauty and grace in high society. But after Lisa's birth, her demeanor changed drastically. Kate noticed it first in the way Mrs. Cooper lingered in bed longer each morning, her eyes dull, her voice hollow. Then came the outbursts, sharp, sudden, and directed at anyone who crossed her path. At first, it had been the staff who bore the brunt of her anger, but slowly, Lisa became the primary target. "Lisa, stop crying," Mrs. Cooper's voice cut through the air one afternoon. Kate rushed in from the kitchen to see the baby sobbing on the living room floor, her little arms outstretched for comfort. But instead of bending down to soothe her, Mrs. Cooper stood over her, her hands trembling with frustration. "I can't do this," she whispered, though the words were not meant for anyone but herself. Kate's instinct was to intervene, to sweep Lisa into her arms and shield her from the woman who was supposed to love her. But she hesitated. She had no authority here, no voice in the Cooper household beyond her role as a maid. Still, her stomach churned every time Mrs. Cooper snapped at Lisa or raised her hand in anger. As the weeks passed, Kate grew more concerned. The bruises on Lisa's arms, the constant crying that filled the halls, she could no longer stand by and watch. She knew something had to be done. But it wasn't until the day she stumbled upon Mr. Cooper's secrets that everything fell into place. Kate had been dusting in Mr. Cooper's study, a room he rarely used when at home. As she wiped down the polished desk, a stack of letters caught her eye, tucked haphazardly into a drawer. Her hands trembled as she skimmed the contents. They were love letters, intimate, personal, addressed to a woman who was most certainly not Mrs. Cooper. Kate's breath hitched as the truth dawned on her. Mr. Cooper's long absences, his coldness toward his wife and daughter. It all made sense now. He wasn't just neglecting his family, he was betraying them. The realization weighed heavy on her, and as she folded the letters back into place, she felt a new wave of dread. What else was he hiding? That night, as Kate was cleaning the hallway outside the master bedroom, she overheard something that chilled her to the bone. Mr. Cooper's voice, low and tense, carried through the slightly ajar door. "We can't keep going like this, Mary," he said. "She's a problem. A daughter? Grow up, get married, and become useless. I can't let this property fall into the hands of another guy." Mrs. Cooper's voice was softer, but there was a quiver of fear in it. "What are you suggesting?" "Bring her to some unknown place and tell the press she died of pneumonia," Mr. Cooper replied, his tone void of emotion. "For good." Kate's heart pounded in her chest. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more. The conversation was brief, but the implication was clear. They were talking about Lisa. Panic surged through Kate's body. She didn't know what Mr. Cooper had in mind, but the thought of anything happening to the little girl made her stomach turn. She needed to act. But how? Who would listen to a maid? What if she was wrong? Yet the weight of the words she had overheard bore down on her, leaving her no choice. She had to protect Lisa, no matter the cost. The clock on the mantel ticked quietly as Kate and Will sat across from each other in the dimly lit kitchen. Kate's eyes were sharp, focused, as she leaned forward, hands clenched on the edge of the table. Will, on the other hand, seemed uneasy, his fingers tapping an erratic rhythm against the tabletop. "We have to do this tonight," Kate whispered, glancing towards the hallway to ensure no one was nearby. "Mr. and Mrs. Cooper will be at that charity gala. It's our only chance." Will rubbed his forehead, clearly torn. "Kate, I don't know. What if we get caught? This isn't some small thing. This is kidnapping." Kate shook her head, her voice firm but quiet. "It's not kidnapping, Will. We're saving her. You know what they do to her. Lisa can't stay here. She deserves better than this place." The name Lisa hung in the air like a plea, pulling Will in. He knew Kate was right. Lisa, with her bright eyes and innocent laugh, deserved to grow up somewhere safe, somewhere far away from the Coopers and their suffocating control. Will exhaled slowly, his resistance crumbling. "All right," he finally said, his voice low but resolute. "But we have to be smart about this. Once they realize she's gone, they'll come after us." Kate's expression softened, a hint of relief washing over her. "We'll be gone before they even notice. You know how these events go. They'll be there for hours." They spent the next few minutes laying out their plan in hushed tones. Kate would sneak into Lisa's room, gather her things, and they would slip out through the back door used by the household staff. Will would have the car ready, waiting in the alley. It was risky, but it was all they had. The night was still, the silence punctuated by the occasional hum of a passing car or the distant barking of a dog. Inside the Cooper mansion, the air was thick with tension as Kate crept down the hallway, her heart pounding with each step. She reached Lisa's room, pausing briefly at the door before pushing it open. The baby lay asleep in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling with the soft rhythm of her breath. Kate's heart ached as she scooped Lisa into her arms, wrapping her in a blanket to shield her from the cool night air. She glanced around the room one last time before heading for the back exit. Her steps were slow, deliberate. She could feel the weight of what they were about to do pressing on her shoulders. When she reached the door, Kate paused, her hand on the handle. She listened, every sense heightened, but the house remained still. She opened the door cautiously and slipped outside, closing it gently behind her. The cool air hit her face, bringing with it a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. As she moved towards the alley where Will was supposed to be waiting, her mind raced. What if he had changed his mind? What if he'd left? She couldn't do this alone, not with Lisa in her arms. But then, as she rounded the corner, there he was. Will stood next to the car, a silent silhouette in the dim light. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm, though his eyes betrayed his nerves. Kate climbed into the car, carefully settling Lisa in her lap. Will glanced over at her, and for the first time that night, their eyes met, a shared understanding passing between them. This was no longer just about Lisa. Their fates were now tied together, for better or worse. They drove through the empty streets, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the space between them. After what felt like hours, they arrived at the edge of town, where Will's aunt, Jessie, lived. Her small house sat tucked away at the end of a gravel road, the porch light flickering faintly. Jessie opened the door as soon as they pulled up, her face a mixture of surprise and concern. "Will, what's going on?" she asked, her eyes darting to Kate and the baby in her arms. "We need your help, Aunt Jessie," Will said simply. "It's a long story, but Lisa can't stay with the Coopers anymore. We need a place to stay, just for a little while." Jessie's gaze softened as she looked at the baby, then back at Will. "Of course. Come in, all of you." As they stepped inside, Kate felt a small sense of relief. They had made it out. For now, they were safe. But in the back of her mind, the weight of what was to come still lingered. The Coopers wouldn't let this go easily, and the real fight was only just beginning. Jessie leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the worn-out table in the small motel room. Across from him, Kate sat clutching a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The weight of sleepless nights darkened her eyes. Lisa, the little girl they were determined to protect, was playing quietly in the corner, her innocent humming a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "She's coming today," Jessie said, glancing at his phone again. "Sophia, the social worker. We can trust her. I've known her for years." Kate gave a slight nod, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know how much longer we can do this, Jessie. Every time I close my eyes, I imagine Mr. Cooper finding us. His voice, those threats. It feels like he's everywhere." Jessie reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but stopping just short of touching. "We're not alone in this, Kate. Sophia is good at what she does. She'll help us build a case, protect Lisa." Before Kate could respond, a soft knock echoed through the room. Jessie stood, moving toward the door with cautious steps. When he opened it, a woman in her mid-30s with dark, curly hair and a professional air stepped inside. Sophia's warm but determined gaze swept the room before settling on Kate. "Jessie filled me in on some of the details," Sophia began, offering a small smile as she sat down. "I know this is overwhelming, but I'm here to help. My first priority is making sure Lisa is safe." Kate exhaled slowly, relief mingling with the constant undercurrent of anxiety. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. We don't know what else to do. The Coopers, they're dangerous. They've got people, money, and power. We're nobody." Sophia nodded, understanding in her eyes. "They may have power, but the law is still on your side, Kate. We need to gather as much evidence as we can. Documentation of their threats, any signs of abuse or neglect that Lisa might have suffered. It's going to be a long process, but every step we take will help build a solid case." Kate looked over at Lisa, who was now drawing on a piece of paper. "She's just a kid," Kate whispered. "She doesn't deserve any of this." Sophia followed Kate's gaze, her expression softening. "No, she doesn't. And that's why we need to act quickly. I'll help you navigate the legal system, but we'll also need to be careful. The Coopers won't go down without a fight." Jessie leaned forward, his jaw clenched. They're already making moves. We got a letter this morning, a warning. They want Lisa back, or else. Sophia's face tightened. Did you keep the letter? Jesse nodded, pulling out the crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket and handing it to her. Sophia scanned the note, her lips pressed into a thin line. This is enough to file for a restraining order, at least to buy us some time, but we'll need more to fully protect her. Kate buried her face in her hands, the pressure of their situation weighing heavily on her. I don't know if I can do this. Every day feels like a nightmare. Sophia placed a hand gently on Kate's shoulder. I know it feels impossible, but you're doing something incredibly brave. You're protecting her. That takes strength, and we'll get through this together. Jesse stood up and began pacing the room. So what's next? How do we even start gathering evidence when we're hiding out in a place like this? Sophia set the letter aside and leaned forward, her tone steady. First, we document everything, any contact, any signs of surveillance, and anything suspicious. Second, we'll start compiling a history of the Coopers' behavior toward Lisa, their neglect, and any abuse. I'll work on getting witnesses lined up. You just focus on staying safe and keeping Lisa out of sight. Kate nodded, but doubt lingered in her eyes. And what if they find us? Sophia didn't sugarcoat her response. We'll cross that bridge if we get to it. For now, we stay ahead of them and we stay smart. As Sophia stood to leave, she glanced back at Lisa, who was now watching them with wide, curious eyes. She deserves a chance at a better life, Kate. You're giving her that chance. Don't lose sight of that. Kate swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The door clicked shut behind Sophia, leaving Jesse and Kate alone again in the dim room. For the first time in weeks, though, there was a flicker of hope. It was faint and fragile, but it was there. And that, for now, was enough to keep them going. The clock on the wall ticked in rhythmic silence as Kate sat across from Mr. Cooper in the dimly lit room. His fingers drummed lightly on the wooden table, the tension palpable. Kate's eyes narrowed, sensing the weight of the moment. She had expected a confrontation, but not this. Mr. Cooper cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I'll cut to the chase," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something sinister. "You've done a good job caring for Lisa, but this situation is complicated." He leaned forward, placing a thick envelope on the table. The edges bulged slightly, betraying the weight of the money inside. "Take this, and let's end this quietly. No need to drag things out. Hand over Lisa. Forget this ever happened, and move on. This is more than enough to start over." Kate glanced at the envelope but didn't move. Her face remained unreadable, though inside fury simmered. "Is that what you think?" she asked quietly, locking eyes with Mr. Cooper. "That I can just put a price on Lisa's life? You didn't want her before, you didn't care. Now you do?" Mr. Cooper's lips tightened. "You're not in a position to decide her future. We are her family." Kate's jaw clenched. "You had your chance. You don't deserve her." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Mr. Cooper's eyes darkened as he stood abruptly, pocketing the envelope with one swift motion. "You'll regret this, Miss Williams. Mark my words." He strode out of the room, leaving Kate with a growing sense of unease. That night, the storm outside mirrored the chaos brewing within Jesse's small house. The wind howled, rattling the windows as the family prepared for bed. Kate sat by the window, staring into the blackness, her mind racing. Mr. Cooper's threat had unsettled her, but she wasn't one to be easily intimidated. She just couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering echoed from the back of the house. Kate bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Will!" she called out, rushing to the hallway. Will appeared just as startled, his eyes wide. Without a word, they both ran towards the noise. In the kitchen, shadows danced wildly, and the intruders had already made their move. Two figures were attempting to break through the back door, their intent clear. Lisa was their target. "Stop!" Kate yelled, grabbing a kitchen chair and swinging it toward one of the masked men. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow. Will lunged at the other, catching him off guard and pinning him to the floor. The struggle was brief, but enough to scare the attackers off. They scrambled out of the broken door, disappearing into the stormy night. Breathless and shaken, Kate dropped the chair, her hands trembling. "They're trying to take her," she whispered, her voice breaking. Will nodded, equally shaken but determined. "We need to be careful. This isn't over." Days passed, and the police managed to capture one of the intruders from that night. He was sitting in a cold, grey interrogation room, his expression hardened by years of criminal work. But something was different this time. He had been double-crossed. "Cooper didn't pay us," the man spat angrily when confronted by the detectives. "We were supposed to get a good cut for taking the girl, but the deal fell through. Now they're trying to bury this, pretend like nothing happened." The detective leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. "You're saying you'll testify against Cooper?" The man's eyes gleamed with a mix of bitterness and defiance. "I'll do more than that. I'll make sure that bastard pays." Word of the man's confession quickly reached Kate, who sat with Will and Jessie, their hearts heavy but hopeful. "This could change everything," Kate said, a spark of hope lighting up her weary face. "If he testifies, we might finally have a chance to expose the Coopers for who they really are." Will squeezed her hand gently. "We'll fight this. We won't let them take Lisa." Kate nodded, though her gaze wandered out the window again, the shadows still lurking in her thoughts. The battle wasn't over, but at least, for now, they had a glimmer of hope. Kate stepped into the dimly lit courtroom, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched her note. Sophia and Will walked closely beside her, their presence offering a silent strength she desperately needed. Across the room, Mr. and Mrs. Cooper stood with stiff postures, their eyes filled with a bitter mix of disdain and defiance. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. As the judge took his seat, the gavel struck the desk, signaling the beginning of the trial. The Cooper family attorney wasted no time, launching into a harsh accusation. "Kate Morgan is guilty of abducting Lisa Cooper. She has taken a child that is not hers, manipulating the child for her own emotional gain." The words sliced through the room and Kate's pulse quickened. But she kept her composure. She wasn't here for herself. She was here for Lisa. Sophia stood up with calm authority, her voice clear and measured. "Your Honor, the accusations against my client are not only false, but defamatory. Kate Morgan did not abduct Lisa. She rescued her." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, and Mrs. Cooper's eyes narrowed as she folded her arms tightly across her chest. The tension between the two sides was almost suffocating. "The Coopers have continuously mistreated Lisa," Sophia continued, holding up a set of documents. "We have evidence from multiple sources that Lisa was subjected to emotional and physical neglect while under their care. I would like to present these statements from their former housekeepers, as well as recordings of several distressing incidents." The courtroom fell silent as Sophia played the first audio clip. A woman's voice, one of the Coopers' former housekeepers, detailed the cold, dismissive treatment that Lisa received daily, how Mrs. Cooper barely acknowledged her, leaving the child to wander the house alone, often crying for attention that never came. It was harrowing, And even though Kate had already heard the recordings before, they made her heart ache anew. Across the aisle, Mrs. Cooper's lips pursed tightly. Mr. Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Their lawyer, however, wasn't ready to concede. These so-called witnesses are disgruntled former employees. They have every reason to lie. The Coopers are loving parents who have always provided for Lisa. Any claims to the contrary are mere fabrications. Kate glanced at Sophia, her mind racing. Could they really ignore the overwhelming evidence? But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Cooper, her face flushed with anger, suddenly stood up, unable to contain herself. "Loving parents," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "I never wanted that child. She was nothing but a burden from the start." The room fell deathly silent. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on Mrs. Cooper, her face pale as she realized the gravity of her words. The judge raised his hand for silence as gasps echoed through the room. Sophia's sharp eyes gleamed, sensing the shift in momentum. Sophia wasted no time. "Your Honor, you've just heard Mrs. Cooper's own admission. She never wanted Lisa. That's not the sentiment of a caring, protective parent. It's clear now that Lisa was viewed as an inconvenience, not a child to be nurtured." Kate couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time, the truth was out in the open. The lies that had suffocated Lisa's life were finally unraveling, and she could sense that they were gaining ground. She tightened her grip on the edge of the table, willing herself to stay strong. After a long pause, the judge turned to address both sides. His expression was thoughtful, yet stern. "Given the evidence provided and the disturbing admission we have just heard, I am granting temporary custody of Lisa Cooper to Kate Morgan, pending further investigation." Kate felt the weight lift off her chest. It wasn't over yet. There would still be battles ahead. But for now, Lisa would be safe. She glanced over at Sophia and Will, both of whom gave her encouraging nods. It was a small victory, but an important one. They had taken the first step towards securing a better future for Lisa. And nothing was more important than that. As the courtroom began to clear, Kate let out a long, shaky breath. The fight was far from over, but they had something they hadn't had before: hope. Kate sat in her modest kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. She stared at the half-filled cup of coffee, her hands gripping the mug as though it were the only thing tethering her to the present moment. Outside, the late autumn sunlight cast long shadows across the yard, but it was cold, chilling, much like the situation she found herself in. The Cooper family wasn't backing down. Their first legal battle may have ended with the court favoring Kate, but it didn't stop them from waging war. They had the money, influence, and connections to stretch this fight out indefinitely, and they were using every tool at their disposal to tear her down. The tabloids had started running hit pieces, painting her as a manipulative, cold-hearted woman who was exploiting the situation for attention. Worse yet, protests had been organized, and just yesterday, a small but vocal group gathered outside her workplace, chanting her name as if it was something vile. Kate sighed, sinking deeper into her chair. Each day was a new confrontation, a fresh reminder of how precarious her life had become. She wondered, often now, if it was all worth it. The Cooper family's influence was far-reaching, but there was something they hadn't counted on: Sophia. Her best friend had never once faltered in her belief in Kate's innocence and determination. Sophia's online campaign had taken off. The hashtags, the posts, the articles, each one peeling back the facade of the Coopers' seemingly untouchable image. Piece by piece, their dark history was being unveiled, their actions scrutinized by the very public they thought they controlled. Kate's story was spreading, and with it came an outpouring of support. "Have you seen this?" Will asked, stepping into the kitchen. He held his phone out, a video playing. A young woman on screen was talking about how Kate had helped her out of a dangerous situation years ago, describing her as kind, selfless, and brave. Kate didn't lift her eyes. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Will. They're everywhere. Every time I step outside, there's someone waiting, watching. What if I'm making it worse for Lisa?" Her voice wavered, the burden of the fight growing heavier with each passing day. Will sat across from her, his usual steady demeanor softening. "Kate, you're doing everything you can for her. These people, they're trying to scare you. Don't let them. You've got more people behind you now than you did at the start. Sophia's been amazing, and look at how many are standing with you now." "I'm not sure it's enough," she whispered. "I never wanted this. I just wanted to protect her." Will reached across the table, resting his hand over hers. "And you are. Don't forget why you started all this. You're strong, Kate. You've faced worse and come out the other side." Sophia entered the room, her energy cutting through the melancholy atmosphere. "I've got some good news. The latest post? It's gone viral. People are catching on, Kate. The Coopers can't hide forever. I promise you that." Kate gave a small nod, but the doubt lingered. She wanted to believe them, to let their confidence fuel her own. But the pressure of it all, being the one responsible for uncovering the truth while also carrying the weight of Lisa's future, was overwhelming. Every threat that landed in her inbox, every sneer from someone she once called a friend, was a reminder of how fragile this fight was. "There's a protest tomorrow," she said quietly. "They'll be outside the courthouse again. I don't know if I can handle that." Sophia moved closer, her voice low and steady. "You're not alone. Will and I will be with you. And trust me, you have a whole world of people standing behind you now. Don't let the Coopers win by making you doubt yourself." Kate glanced at them, her eyes searching for strength, for something to hold on to. In Will and Sophia, she found it, a spark, a reminder that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Slowly she stood, taking a deep breath. "All right," she said, her voice firmer now. "Let's keep going. But if this gets worse, I'm pulling back. I won't let Lisa be caught in the middle of their games." Will smiled, a glimmer of hope returning to his face. "We've got this, Kate, one step at a time." The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in days, Kate felt like maybe, just maybe, she could keep fighting. The courtroom was colder than Kate expected. Despite the warmth outside, the air conditioning hummed loudly in the near-empty room, creating a sterile atmosphere. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her papers, trying to shake off the nerves that had been building for days. Next to her, Sophia sat calm and collected, her dark eyes scanning the room with precision. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but the reality of it weighed heavily on both of them now. Kate stole a glance at the Coopers, sitting rigidly on the other side of the room. Mr. Cooper's face was pale, a stark contrast to Mrs. Cooper's cold, expressionless gaze. They didn't acknowledge her. They hadn't since the accusations began, but that didn't matter. What mattered was Lisa and the truth that had to be revealed. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. The last hearing, the last chance to set everything right. Sophia leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "You're ready. Just tell the truth." Kate nodded, her throat dry. The truth. It sounded simple enough, but the weight of it felt suffocating. The proceedings began, the lawyers exchanging formalities, but Kate could barely register the words. It wasn't until her name was called that reality snapped back into focus. She rose, her legs feeling unsteady, and walked to the stand. The judge's eyes settled on her, and she took a deep breath before beginning. "I never intended to harm anyone." Kate's voice trembled slightly at first, but she quickly steadied herself. "I took Lisa from that house because I feared for her safety. She was neglected, mistreated, and I did what any mother would do: protect her." The courtroom remained quiet, the tension almost tangible. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room on her, but none felt as heavy as the one from Mrs. Cooper. Her icy stare cut through the air like a blade, yet Kate continued. "I witnessed things in that house. Things no child should endure. Lisa would cry for hours, and no one would come. She was left alone in her room, ignored, and at times, they." Kate paused, her voice catching. "They punished her for the smallest of things. It wasn't right." Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The judge nodded, signaling for her to continue. Sophia stood up next, presenting the evidence. Each piece was meticulously documented: photos, medical reports, even statements from neighbors. It painted a grim picture of life inside the Cooper household, one that left little room for doubt. The Coopers' lawyer objected, of course. He tried to paint Kate as unstable, desperate, a woman driven by her own past rather than Lisa's needs. But Sophia was quick to dismantle his arguments, her calm yet assertive tone leaving no stone unturned. And then came Mrs. Cooper's testimony. She rose slowly, her sharp features unmoving as she took the stand. Her voice, cool and calculated, filled the room as she denied every accusation. "We loved Lisa," she said flatly. "Whatever Kate claims to have seen is simply a misunderstanding." Kate clenched her fists under the table. The words felt like venom, spreading doubt. But she held her ground. After what felt like an eternity, the judge called for a recess. Kate stepped outside the courtroom, Sophia following close behind. "You're doing great," Sophia said, her hand on Kate's shoulder. "They can't deny the evidence. Just a little longer." Kate nodded, though the exhaustion was starting to creep in. She had fought so hard for this, for Lisa's safety. But the final steps always felt the hardest. The thought of Lisa, her innocent eyes, the way she clung to her at night, pushed her forward. When they returned, the judge wasted no time in delivering the verdict. The evidence was overwhelming. Mr. and Mrs. Cooper were found guilty of child neglect and abuse, their parental rights revoked. The courtroom was still, but the relief that washed over Kate felt like a tidal wave. As the gavel struck, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. Sophia smiled faintly beside her. "You did it." Kate rose slowly, walking out of the courtroom into the sunlight. Lisa was safe now, far away from the people who had caused her so much pain. For the first time in a long time, Kate felt like she could breathe again. This was just the beginning, but for now, it was enough. The morning light filtered through the old oak trees that lined Jessie's estate, casting a soft glow on the newly painted walls of the house. Kate stood by the window, her eyes following Lisa as she played with a makeshift swing, her laughter echoing in the garden. Will leaned against the doorway, watching Kate, his arms crossed, but his expression relaxed. "She seems happy here," Will said, his voice low but content. Kate nodded, her gaze still on Lisa. "Happier than I've seen her in a long time. This place, it feels different." "It's home now," Will added, stepping closer. "For all of us." Kate turned, smiling faintly at him. "I never thought it would be like this. Jessie's house. It was always so quiet. Now, it's full of life." The two stood in silence for a moment, each absorbing the peace that had come with the changes in their lives. After all the uncertainty, the fear, and the fight to protect Lisa, they had found a new purpose. Jessie's suggestion to turn her large estate into a shelter for abandoned and mistreated children had given them a new focus. "Do you think we're ready for this?" Kate finally asked, breaking the silence. Will chuckled softly. "Were we ever ready for any of this? We've just been figuring it out as we go." Kate smiled, a bit of tension easing from her shoulders. "I guess you're right. It's just opening the shelter, taking care of more kids. It feels huge." Will nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "It is huge, but we won't be doing it alone. Jessie's got the connections, and we've got each other. And Lisa, well, she's proof we can make it work." They looked back at the little girl, now trying to balance on one leg while pretending to fly. The past months had been hard. Grief, fear, and uncertainty clung to them like shadows. But those shadows had begun to lift, little by little. "I want to help them," Kate said, more to herself than to Will. "The kids who have no one, like Lisa was, like so many others." Will reached out, taking her hand gently. "And we will. But you don't have to do it all at once. One step at a time, Kate." Kate squeezed his hand, grateful for his steadiness. "One step at a time," she repeated, as though the words themselves could ground her. They spent the rest of the morning planning. Jessie had already laid the groundwork for the shelter, a place where children could come and find not just a roof over their heads, but care, education, and a chance for a better life. Will discussed the logistics, while Kate thought of ways to make the house feel warm and welcoming, not just for Lisa, but for the other children who would soon fill its rooms. By late afternoon they gathered on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Lisa was inside, already asleep after a long day of playing, and the quiet of the evening settled over them. "It's funny," Kate said softly, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "I used to think life would just get harder, but now, I don't know. I feel hopeful." Will turned to her, his expression softening. "You're not alone anymore, Kate. That makes a difference." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words deep in her bones. They weren't alone. Not anymore. As the days passed, the house began to fill, first with small signs of change: extra beds, rooms painted in soft colors, toys and books scattered about. Then the children came. Some were quiet and withdrawn, others loud and full of energy, each carrying their own stories of abandonment and pain. But with every passing day, the house became more than just walls and windows. It became a place of healing, of laughter, of love. Kate, Will, and Jessie worked side by side, slowly building a future not just for Lisa, but for every child who walked through the door. They faced challenges, of course: funding, staffing, the emotional toll of caring for so many young lives. But they faced them together, stronger as a family. And as the months turned into years, the shelter grew. Their home expanded, both physically and emotionally. Kate looked at Will one evening, the house now full of children's laughter, and realized that what they had built together was more than just a shelter. It was a family, one that grew not by blood, but by love, resilience, and hope. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. Wow, what an inspiring journey, right? Kate, Will, and Lisa's story reminds us all of the incredible power of love and resilience. It's not just about finding a home, it's about creating one, full of hope, laughter, and new beginnings. They started with nothing but a dream, and now they've built a family that's not defined by blood, but by the love they share with those who need it most. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Share your thoughts in the comments. And of course, hit that subscribe button for more stories that move, inspire, and bring us all closer together. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay hopeful and spread kindness.